A shot was fired in Minnesota, but what followed after that was not just another incident. It was a warning, because that same night, an order came from Washington. That order said the situation would only come under control if Minnesota handed over its most sensitive voter information to the federal government. So the question now is, how are we supposed to understand this? Can a government become so rigid, so determined to get its way that human lives begin to feel expendable? Is this truly about law and order, or is it about using fear as a tool of power? Stay with us in this video, because ahead we will explain what is really going on inside the minds of Pam Bondi and the former president. And if you want calm, fact-based reporting without fear or noise, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it, so the truth doesn't get buried. A shot was fired in Minnesota, and in that moment, this stopped being just a local incident. Because after the shot was fired, attention slowly began to shift away from Minnesota and toward the center, toward Washington. The questions that were first focused on the scene itself started moving toward decisions being made in Washington. That was the point where this story stopped being ordinary. Normally, when an incident happens inside a state, the response comes from local authorities. But here, within a very short time, the role of the federal government began to emerge clearly. Statements started coming out. The tone hardened, and the language of law and order was pushed to the front. Now, look carefully at the sequence. First, the incident, then fear, and immediately after that, the talk of control. This was not a random chain of events. As the discussion around the incident grew, it increasingly felt as though the situation was being portrayed as something that could not be handled to ordinary means. This is where pressure becomes visible. If this was only a Minnesota incident, why did the federal government need to step in so quickly and so deeply? And if the situation was truly under control, why was the language of fear made so prominent? These are not emotional questions, they are logical ones, because a response is usually proportional to the event, unless something else is driving it. In Minnesota's case, the response appeared to go far beyond the incident itself. This was no longer just a matter of investigation, it was becoming an administrative direction. And when an administration sets a direction, its impact does not remain limited to officials alone. It affects the entire system. At the local level, there was uncertainty, there was fear, and there were no clear answers. But the signals coming from Washington were making one thing clear. The priority was no longer explanation. The priority was control. And this is where the scope of the story expands. Because control does not stay limited to a single incident. It extends to policy, it extends to data, and it extends to authority. And that is why, after this incident, there was discussion of steps that had no direct connection to the place where the shot was fired. These steps were not about one state alone. They were about the structure itself. Now consider this. If an atmosphere of fear had not been created, if the incident had not been amplified the way it was, would such broad decisions have been possible so quickly? That question takes this story far beyond a single event. Because here, the incident becomes a trigger, and after that, the ground is prepared for decisions. Decisions that do not remain limited to Minnesota. Decisions that touch the balance between states and the federal government. And this is where it becomes clear that this story does not stop with the shot that was fired in Minnesota. This story is about the direction in which power moved afterward. And in that direction, the next question emerges. While all of this was happening, what was being prepared in Washington? What decisions were taking final shape behind the scenes? And why did the role of the federal government become so decisive so quickly after this incident? During all of this, Washington was not simply responding, it was preparing. Because what followed was not confusion, and it was not a rushed decision. It was a deliberate structure. Behind closed doors, the language began to change. From response to pressure, from public safety to compliance. And slowly, the focus settled on something very specific, control through information. This is where the pressure became unmistakable, because in the days that followed, the messages coming from the center were no longer vague. They were calculated. They were targeted. And they came with conditions that had no direct connection to the scene itself, no connection to the moment when the shot was fired in Minnesota. This is where the key question becomes clear. What exactly was the federal government asking for? Because the steps being discussed were not about deploying more security forces. They were not about announcing new laws. They were about voter records, the most sensitive voter information held by the state, names, addresses, registration data, and voting-related details. That was the information the center was seeking access to, and this demand did not arrive through an ordinary administrative process. It surfaced at the exact moment when fear was at its peak, when questions had been pushed aside, and when law and order was being placed above everything else. This is where the story grows more serious, because voter data is not ordinary information. It is the backbone of a democracy. And when access to that data is presented as a necessary step after a crisis, questions become unavoidable. Was this demand truly connected to the incident itself? Or was the incident used as a gateway, a means to reach a different objective? This is where concern begins, because now the issue is no longer safety. It is access. And access, when concentrated in the hands of power, does not remain limited to the moment it is granted. Its consequences travel far. By this point, the incident in Minnesota had already served its purpose. It had redirected attention, it had accelerated fear, and it had prepared the ground for decisions that would otherwise have faced resistance. Emergencies are not meant to function this way. In a healthy system, a crisis demands transparency. It demands restraint, and it demands accountability. But instead, a familiar pattern emerged. First, shock, then urgency, and after that, demands that reach far beyond the event itself. That is why what was demanded in Washington matters more than the incident alone. Because when the federal government moves beyond response and begins setting conditions, the balance shifts, not only between institutions, but between citizens and the state. And once that balance is disturbed, it does not quietly return. That is why the story does not remain limited to Minnesota. It reaches every place where voting happens, where rights exist, and where democracy functions. And now the central question becomes unavoidable. Was all of this mere coincidence, or was a single incident deliberately used to advance a much larger objective? This is where the next layer of this story begins. And this is where Pam Bondi enters the picture, not as a background figure and not as a passive official, but as the messenger. Because it was her office that formalized the shift from atmosphere to action. What had until then been signals, language, and pressure was now put into writing. A letter, official, deliberate, and carefully timed. It did not focus on the incident itself. It did not center on facts from the scene, and it did not wait for clarity to emerge. Instead, it framed the moment as a breakdown of order, a crisis, and then it offered a solution, not one rooted in investigation or accountability or restraint, but one rooted in compliance. Under the banner of restoring law and order, conditions were laid out, conditions that aligned perfectly with what had already been forming behind the scenes: access, cooperation, and control. This was not a random response to an isolated event. It was a continuation of the direction that had already been set, because Pam Bondi's role here was not to explain what happened in Minnesota. Her role was to translate pressure into policy, to take an atmosphere of fear and convert it into an administrative demand, and that matters. Because when a moment of crisis is followed by a demand from the highest legal authority, it changes the equation. States are no longer responding to an incident. They're responding to the federal government, and that shift is the entire point. This is how authority expands, not all at once, not loudly, but step by step. First, fear, then urgency, then a letter that frames compliance as responsibility. And once that framework is accepted, the discussion is no longer about whether the demand is appropriate. It becomes about whether resistance is even possible. That is why Pam Bondi's involvement cannot be viewed as procedural. It was strategic. It took everything that had been building since the shot was fired in Minnesota and moved it into the realm of enforcement. And from that moment on, this was no longer just a political debate. It was a test of boundaries, of authority, and of how far a crisis could be used to reshape the balance between states and the center. And that brings us to the next question. Once that letter was sent, what options were really left, and who at that point was actually in control? And this is where the role of the former president becomes impossible to separate from what was unfolding, because this was never just about one letter or one official or one incident. It was about timing. At a moment when political stakes were already high and when control of future elections was becoming central, the pressure did not come in isolation. It aligned. The former president's public language had already set the stage: distrust in elections, distrust in systems, and repeated claims that outcomes could not be trusted unless authority was centralized. Against that backdrop, a demand for voter data was not a technical request, it was a strategic one. Because access to that data does not simply provide information, it provides leverage. It reveals patterns, it identifies targets, it allows decisions to be shaped before a single vote is cast, and this is where the risk becomes clear. Because when sensitive voter information is concentrated at the federal level, its potential use extends far beyond oversight. It can be used to challenge ballots selectively, to question registration strategically, to apply pressure where resistance is weakest, not openly, not all at once, but quietly, procedurally, under the cover of legality. This is why the former president's role cannot be dismissed as rhetorical. His past statements about elections were not abstract opinions. They were signals. Signals that losing outcomes would not be accepted. Signals that rules could be reinterpreted. And signals that power, once obtained, would be used to prevent future loss. In that context, the demand for voter data takes on a different meaning. It stops being about accuracy and starts being about control, because data, in the wrong hands, does not protect democracy. It reshapes it. And once reshaped, it becomes difficult to recognize what has been lost. This is not speculation. History shows that when electoral systems are managed by those with a direct stake in the outcome, the system itself begins to bend, not through dramatic acts, but through incremental ones. A record questioned here, a ballot delayed there, a rule reinterpreted quietly, each step defensible on its own, but together transformational. And that is why the convergence of pressure from Washington, the formal role played by Pam Bondi, and the former president's long-standing fixation on elections matters so deeply, because it reveals intent. Not intent stated plainly, but intent revealed through action, through timing, through coordination, and through the choice of what was demanded in the wake of a crisis. This is where the story moves beyond personalities. It becomes structural. It becomes about how easily fear can be used to unlock access, and how once access is granted, the line between governance and manipulation begins to blur. That is the danger at the heart of this moment. Not what has already happened, but what becomes possible once the door is opened. And that is why the question we are left with is not about Minnesota alone. It is about whether a single incident can be used to quietly rewire the foundations of an election system. And once that process begins, who is truly positioned to stop it? And now, when we bring this entire story together, the picture becomes even clearer. This was not just a story about Minnesota. It was not just about a single shot being fired. It was not just about a letter, an official, or even one administration. This was a story about opportunity. An opportunity created by fear. An opportunity created by distraction. And an opportunity where power found room to expand. First, an incident occurred. Then that incident was framed as disorder. Then law and order was placed above everything else. And within that atmosphere, demands began to surface that had no direct connection to the incident itself. Sensitive voter data, records, access, that was the real issue. Because elections are not just about casting ballots. They are built on trust, and trust is rooted in these systems. When those systems are opened under pressure and fear, questions become unavoidable. Was this truly about safety, or was it about control? History shows us again and again that democracy rarely collapses in a single dramatic moment. It erodes through paperwork, through files, through phrases like necessary steps. Once limits are removed in the name of crisis, they rarely return quietly. And that is why this story does not end here. Because the real question is not what happened in Minnesota. The real question is this. When the next crisis comes, will democracy once again be asked to pay the price? Will institutions recognize their limits? Will states assert their role? And will the public ask questions before it is too late? Because power always expands the same way, quietly, gradually, and often under the cover of an emergency. And by the time people realize what has changed, much of it has already changed. That is why stories like this must be told, not to spread fear, but to demand awareness. Because democracy remains protected only as long as there are eyes watching it closely. And when those eyes close, change happens without a sound. That is the true meaning of this story.